Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce Dr. Shelley Armitage. She is the Dorrance Roderick Professor Emerita from University of Texas, El Paso, where she taught interdisciplinary courses in arts and the environment. Her most recent book is Walking the Llano, a Texas memoir of place. And this story is about walking a riverbed in the northern edge of the Llano Estacado, and it unites her family history with observations about change and the long history of the place. She has written many books in the area of fine arts and also in the area of women writers. Is that appropriate? What was the title of the one book? Women's work. So I will yield to Shelley.
I want to say thank you for having me here. I'm just really appreciative to be part of this great conference. I was very impressed with what went on yesterday, and so we'll hope not to disappoint now. I wanted just to start by point of reference to read a couple of passages, one by Leslie Marmon Silko. The term landscape, as it's entered the English language, is misleading. A portion of territory the eye can comprehend in a single view does not correctly describe the relationship between the human being and his or her surroundings. This assumes the viewer is somehow outside or separate from the territory he or she surveys. Viewers are as much a part of the landscape as the boulders they stand on. And then a second comment here by May Sarton, why is there no poet of the plains? So in 2005, I was very bored in the small town I grew up in, Vega, Texas, even though I retain a house there and have a farm that I'm privileged to still own. So I started hiking around, and this is part of the northern part of the Llano Estacado. So it's flatlands, but then goes into breaks toward the Canadian River in the north. And in my hikes, I discovered that, to my surprise, that the family farms was in an area where the Middle Alamosa Creek heads, and that's a primary tributary of the Canadian River. Of course, it's dry most of the year, and on our farm, there were a couple of draws that were actually where the creek had originally headed. So I got intrigued by that, and I looked finally on a topo map, and I realized that in 30 meandering miles, the Middle Alamosa emptied into a place called Isabel's Camp. And my dad had known Isabel when Isabel was a very old man, almost 90 years old, and my dad was 16. And my dad told Isabel stories, some of which I remembered. I wish I remembered more. But in other words, the arc of the two men's story was connected not only through their stories, the knowledge of each other, but through the landscape, because Armitage Farms really connected through the Middle Alamosa to Isabel's Camp, where his dugout had been. There's still an old adobe there that he had built after he had his dugout. So I was on a trail. I'm a researcher by nature, a writer maybe by second nature, and so I started walking, and all of a sudden I realized that there was a connection with the rhythm of the land and my own discoveries and what became writing. And that particularly memoir, which you probably will agree with me, is a suitable avenue for this kind of recording of experience, because memoir is about interiority, but it's also about the exterior. So it was a perfect way to record things I found, but also to reflect upon them. And even memory, that fickle twin of imagination, could be at play in remembering my childhood. And trying really, a primary goal was to restore the disappeared voices and stories of this landscape, the Hispano people, Native American life there. The Antelope Creek Phase people were traders with the Anasazi. They're little known to most people. They populated that area. The Comanche and Kiowa, the ancient peoples. And so that was also a goal of mine, to try to connect things to connect the stories, to connect the movement through the landscape. So I'm going to read, first I want to show you, though, the context of this to give you an idea of what things sort of look like. This is a map of where I hiked from west of Vega, Texas to the Canadian River. And I say hiked, I spent several summers doing this because I was still working. But I traced and retraced my steps down the Middle Alamosa Creek. And I don't know if you can see, but Father Wind is blowing down here quite heavily. So this is the Middle Alamosa, and it changes provocatively all along. But this is a great shot of it to show the play of wind and water. This is my dad. This is when he first bought the farm, about 1926. And this is a photo of him at a wheat harvest. Something that happened during my hikes was that I lost my whole family, my original family. He was already deceased, but during my hikes, my mother declined and finally died, and my brother died. So part of what I talk about in the book is wanting to be adopted by the land itself and feeling companioned by it and parented by it as I suffered these losses, both adventure and hiking, but losses of family. This is my granddad, who was in the early day Forest Service in Mena, Arkansas. This is 1904, and he's not the guy in the front, but the guy on the left in his sheepskin chaps. And I say in the book, well, he was my first image of a Western man. This is Isabel at his dugout on the Canadian River. I'm sorry it's such a bad photo, but you can imagine that I think this is the only photo that I could find of Isabel. The Canadian River at that point was fairly deep and narrow. This is before the coming of the cattle. So that's what really, in part, transformed that landscape and makes it now a broad, almost empty river with several dams on it along the way. This is Armitage Farms, which is a landscape a lot of people say is ugly. I find it extremely beautiful. But, people who don't love the flatlands pass through our country here and say it's unworthy of love. So another purpose, I guess you'd say, of the book was to show that it was worthy of love. And this was one of my running roads. Part of the book is about breath and, movement of the land and breath that comes out, and it comes out as writing. So I ran these roads until I wore my knees out, and then I walked. So I was walking the Llano after that. And this was a scene of the first hike that I took down into the canyon lands when the Llano breaks off into the breaks. So with that, I'm just going to read three short passages. They're not necessarily related, but they give you a little flavor maybe of the book. Walking these plains here on the family farm, 3 miles northwest of Vega and the Texas Panhandle, I lean into a north wind. It's winter, a brownscape tinged in ochre, dried buffalo and grama grasses, a touch of green in the wintered-over yucca and bear grass. Many of the native prairie grasses, like buffalo grass, retain their nourishment through winter, sustenance hidden in their dun middens. The side oats grama wave like sailboat flags, tiered semaphores flexed in the wind. Sacaton is stately by comparison, its undulating trunk bearing a sparkler-shaped burst of seeds. Buffalo hugs the ground, short-legged like its namesake. All are fragile at the picking, but moored in the ceaseless prairie wind. This early morning, the sky is a washed blue, except for the horizon line, which is indigo, deeper key to the continual changes in the weather. Here you see blue northers building, fronts, snows roll in from the north and northwest. I've ridden this road with my dad since I was a baby, later jogging it, giving the gloved wave back to his one-finger greeting as we passed each other, and he drove south back into town. Lately, the resident Swainson's hawk, territorial on his cedar post in early winter, eyes my walk. Running days over, I'm slowed to a pace fit for my desire to write the Llano. For pointed north and alone, I understand the act of walking to be writing, the act of writing, listening, inside and out. What does the land say to us? I've wondered for years. True, there's been no poet of these plains. Plains history is a history of migration, movement, and change, conditions that make people look ahead or look past. But I think if we could read the land as a poem, we might more intimately learn from it, understand what it says of natural and human cycles, and that sometimes uneasy relationship between them. All the old settlers of this part of the country are gone now, like my dad, who came here with his family in 1926 after the flooding of the White Buffalo and Mississippi rivers in Arkansas washed the Armitages from their Delta farm. Memories and stories are lost with this group, but lyric, as fragment, reshapes itself through the subsequent generations. What is left goes on. Residual sites, material survivals, landforms, archaeological sites, abandoned pastori settlements, they all require this other way of telling, the Llanos. You got to time me. The Images poets, particularly those who frequented the New Mexico landscape in Santa Fe and Taos in the 1920s and 30s, understood this other way of knowing and of telling. Poets such as Alice Corbin Henderson and Harriet Monroe took the land and its peoples as subjects, but believed the concrete resonated beyond its descriptive surface. They translated Ezra Pound's ideas about Images poetry to the land's story. An image could supply an instant intuition, catching emotion that generated an intellectual and emotional complex beneath the conventional meaning. The Southwest poet Peggy Pond Church attempted to write poetry whose imagistic aspects functioned as a tongue for the wilderness. Likewise, Mary Austin said, "It's the land that wants to be said," cautioning that one must possess a noticing eye in order to speak for the land. No wonder that later native writers of the Llano, such as Rudolfo Anaya and Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca, would find full and cacophonous that what early travelers described as a silent, empty land. And so part of what happens is, you start, telling your, telling your family history. But then what I found myself feeling like I was in other people's stories. And I thought that was the great learning point. It's not my story, but to be in somebody else's story. So I say, sitting atop a tractor gave me a new perspective, maybe something like when white Western women first sat a horse. It was an equalizer of sorts, but also the view made me think about how the North Draw had been the scene of deprivation, kidnapping, and murder. There was pain here, mainly to do with animals. Dad had shot a cow once with a .30-06, a powerful hunting rifle displayed in the gun cabinet and never used. We'd spent the winter keeping her alive after she breech-birthed a large calf born dead, which paralyzed her. Dad tried everything, cattle prod, ropes to pull her up, feed left a few feet away. Nothing worked, and by spring she had lost her will. The sight of him pulling the calf from her and then stuffing the bloody womb back inside stuck with me, later punctuated by the snap of her head at the rifle shot. Another time we'd had to trick Roy's my brother, one of Roy's Holstein milk cows into the trailer so we could take her to the farm. Her name was Blue because her spots were faded. She was like a family pet and had been raised in the lot behind her house. She trusted us, and when the men released her on the farm, she bawled and ran, chased by the other cattle who smelled a stranger in their midst. I remember sitting between my brother and Dad as the pickup pulled away. They looked straight ahead, pointed toward their futures. I looked back, silently crying in the cab. The plowing made me see time differently, looking back while moving forward. I checked over my shoulder to see if the rows were coming out straight, while at the same time I moved ahead through the unplowed ground, creating them. These comings and goings connect like the wishbone of draws joined out north. Memory isn't about the past, it's about the process of shaping a continuity. I got off, shimmied down the creek bank where I parted the barbed wire and climbed over. I just have one, okay, I can do it in 2 minutes. I hiked with a number of friends from time to time, and this is a experience that happened with one of them. I should say, and this is an important point, by the end of the hikes, when I turned around to go back, 261 wind turbines had been built along the escarpment of the breaks. And although we applaud what wind turbines can do, I'm sure you're all aware that they do have very negative things, not least of which is fragmentation of habitat. So not only was my fairyland destroyed, the pure horizon line, but also there were other worrisome things about this. So I kept holding a vision before me, memory a kind of mirage. In it, Janelle Curfey, another of my hiking buddies who had accompanied Randy, Lisa, and me to Little Arrowhead Peak, were walking the old creek bed north of Tom's camp. She specialized in wildlife identification, and I kept close behind, listening to her musings over one plant or another. We came upon a webbing of sorts, but like a translucent wall, and stopped suddenly to avoid entanglement. It was about 3 feet across and suspended between rank weed stalks. At first we thought it was a spider web, all building up in creation. Then we sensed it was something in its last stages, delicate, decomposing. "What's this?" Janelle asked, tipping her straw hat back in order to bend more closely. The filaments danced in the wind, buoyed this way and that, catching the afternoon light, billowing shadows. "I think this might be the skin of something. No, look, just the hair. What's left?" I said, reaching out but not touching. "Maybe the last stages of some animal, a coyote?" Shapeshifter, trickster, death is like that. It was a feeling I had trying to take care of Mother, the fragility, the threads that barely hung on. One misstep and now that feeling about the land and the turbines too. "Whatever it is, it will go to the loving embrace of Mother Earth," Janelle said. We hovered there, perhaps a moment just before the skin's vacancy would fill the air. "We'll buy your wind," the Cielo wind turbine representative had said, "but the breath of the story is not for sale." It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Theron Francis. And is it Theron or Theron?
I think it's Theron.
You think it's right? Okay, we'll go with what you think. Theron Francis, he received his PhD in American Literature from Purdue University with a dissertation on Thoreau in 2007. He has his dream job, that's really great to know, at Sul Ross State University, where he teaches courses in American Literature, technical writing, linguistics, and composition. He currently serves on the executive committee of the Big Bend Sierra Club and edits the Big Bend Sierra.
Okay, so my paper is on the poetry of a landscape too. And I was troubling over the idea of what I meant by that. And for one thing, I was trying to collect the poetry that was just about the Marfa lights. But then I realized that the lights themselves might be the poetry, which is what I think you were talking about. The land itself has a poetry to it. And I don't like this opening slide either. What I don't like about it is there's one word missing. In the whole paper, this word is not there, and I think it should be there, the word elliptical. And I like the word elliptical because it doesn't say anything. And that's what I'm getting at with my paper. For context, this paper started with a anti-pipeline march, the Second Solidarity March, and I'm going to show, I think, just part of a video about the march. I had to give a reading during the march. Let me. Oh, there it is, but I'm not seeing it there. Okay. Well, let's watch it now. Oh, now we're looking. Okay, that's good.
the struggle, this fight to protect Mother Earth, is no different than the struggle to protect our communities, to protect our water, to protect our women and children and our lives from violence, that these are all connected together. What brings it home is this prayer.
We're at a Energy Transfer Partners Trans-Pecos Pipeline construction site on Highway 90 in between Alpine, Texas and Marfa, Texas. Right now, they're in the middle of trenching where the pipe's gonna run. The pipe is gonna run under this highway, and they're working on the other side too.
It's an ongoing fight that we feel there's a sense of urgency right now because they're moving so fast and they're getting ready to go underneath the Rio Grande, which we believe is just as important, just as sacred as the Missouri or Mississippi, because it is sacred to millions of indigenous people on the U.S. side and the Mexico side, and it does feed millions of people too with water and that resource that they can think is a commodity that should be a human right.
Later down the line, you know, you're gonna poison the waters in the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande carries a bunch of water downstream to a lot of people.
I'm going to stop there because I want to read my paper. But that's the context. That's where I first read a version of this. This past November, I was asked to speak on Native American legends on the Marfa Lights at the start of the Second Solidarity March. The march started at the Marfa Lights Viewing Center on Highway 90, about 1 mile from where trenching for the pipeline crossed the highway. Joining the march were Texas and national water protectors, many of whom were Native Americans, in addition to local activists. When I discovered a poem by W.S. Merwin on the Marfa Lights, however, it occurred to me that there could be a genre of poetry tied just to this place and just these luminous spirits. While searching the Native American myths, I began to doubt that I could find authentic Native stories about the lights to tell the Native Americans who were going to talk about their ties to the land. In Merwin's poem, The Marfa Lights, we can find the most well-known legend. The lights were the ghost of the war chief Alzate, who had been captured and dragged off to his death, and his followers sold into slavery, of course. I've got to get back to the... Who told and retold this legend about the lights as ghostly Indian spirits? Merwin frames it as a tale whispered by herdsmen and cowhands for 100 years. Many of the cowboys in the Big Bend were Native Americans, of course, but of course many were not. Although the legend... I keep on wandering. I'm a wandering person. Although the legend, as retold by Merwin, does recount the history of genocide, it may only be a romantic tale about the last Indians on the frontier. Merwin's account of the fate of Alzate, leader of the Mescalero Apache in the late 19th century, accurately reflects the historical record. Merwin evokes a sense of the sacred through this record of violence, loss, terror. And reflecting on the environmentalism of his poetry, Merwin says that the destruction of the environment and the destruction of human culture through war are connected. It occurred to me that the poetry of the Marfa Lights might not only be attributable to individual poets like Merwin, but to the spirit of the place, or to the spirits. At the beginning of the march, speakers like Frankie Arona of the Texas American Indian Movement and Lori Glover of the Big Bend Sierra Club decried the irrational greed and violence of the pipeline project. I followed their words by observing that poetry, by contrast, conveys truths, and heals rather than harms. We turn to poetry, says Merwin, in times that make us absolutely helpless to say things. Oscar Rodriguez, the Lipan Apache tribal administrator and a past professor at Sulross State University, wrote to me that he could think of no native poems or songs about the lights, but there were numerous oral accounts. To me, explained Rodriguez, the lights are simply a manifestation of a land that's alive and presents more than three dimensions of existence we may be, more than the three dimensions of existence we may be used to. There's more there than meets the eye. My concern is that the pipeline will kill this until now unexplained dimension. For sure, the integrity of the land will suffer greatly for it. According to Rodriguez, the lights are not tied to a particular place, like the convenient highway viewing stand east of Marfa. He gives an account of his family's interaction with the lights. A cousin of mine who's in his late 70s and used to cowboy in the Toyavale area for many years told me that he came to take them for granted, his co-workers too, as they appeared practically every night. Also, they seemed to react to his presence. He said he and other cowboys used to camp with in that area, tried countless times to meet up with the lights, that some guys would go out to meet them while other guys stayed back and observed, but each time the cowboys that went out came back saying they saw nothing, even though the observers said they clearly saw the chasers cross and walk right into the lights. He and others have also said that they came to experience the lights up close, once even inside a house after everybody had gone to sleep. I think I'm a little worried about time. Henry David Thoreau in Allagash and East Branch has an encounter with lights, and his response is similar to W.S. Merwin's. Thoreau encounters a ring of light near his campsite, phosphorescent wood. After waking, he tells his Native American guide about his discovery, who confirms its reality with the Penobscot name for the light, Artusoku. The Native American language is important to Thoreau because it suggests to him the possibility of ideas more closely connected to nature. Talking with his guide leads him to rejoice not in discovery, but in mystery. This mystery is embodied by other things. Honest spirits as good as himself. He is ecstatic. He has leapt out from where he was to a place of reverence. This is a short excerpt from this Maine Woods story. On my inquiring concerning the will of the wisp and like phenomena, the guide said that his folks sometimes saw fires passing along at various heights, even as high as the trees, and making a noise. I was prepared after this to hear the most startling and unimagined phenomena witnessed by his folks. They are abroad at all hours and seasons and seen so unfrequented by white men. Nature must have made 1,000 revelations to them which are secret to us. I exulted like a pagan suckled in a creed that had never been worn at all, but was brand new and adequate to the occasion. I let science slide and rejoice in that light as if it had been a fellow creature. I saw that it was excellent and was very glad to know that it was so cheap. A scientific explanation, as it is called, would have been altogether out of place. Long enough have I heard of irrelevant things. Now at length I was glad to make acquaintance with the light that dwells in rotten wood. Where is all your knowledge gone to? It evaporates quickly, for it has no depth. In his encounter with the lights, Thoreau relinquishes his desire to know. Instead, he embraces the mystery of his fellowship with other beings. He chooses an architectural metaphor for the woods, which are not tenantless, but an inhabited house. There is not an empty chamber in the home. We can conclude that in this dwelling nothing is without use. Everything serves the common and familial purpose. Having entered this dwelling, of fellow creatures, he scorns objective knowledge fabricated in pale daylight. He exalts instead in his shift from knowing to wondering. It is through an opportunity to be ignorant when he faces the lives of others that Thoreau revels in a new wisdom. I also found examples. There's a deep lore in Japanese culture of lights, and they are either phosphorescent wood or they're lights that appear in sunshine at the same time that there is rain, sunshine and rain together. So you might remember the Kurosawa film Dreams, and there is what's called kitsune-bi, foxfire, and that is a token of a fox wedding, which you should not see, or else you might get lost. But it also suggests fertility and a connection with good harvests. Merwin's poem, The Marfa Lights, like Thoreau's encounter with phosphorescent fire in the Maine woods, presents the lights as other beings. They are candles carried by hands never seen. Although the poem may be peopled by lights, personification is the wrong word to describe the figurative device because it would deny the alterity of these spirits. They are animated by Merwin. If in our relationship to them they impart meaning, we can think of them as souls. Merwin situates the lights in a spatial architecture to show their animated, erratic nature. They go up the long stairs of light and along dazzling halls. Peculiarly, Merwin envisions the lights dancing in midday amidst the West Texas sun. We see them as lights which are invisible because they merge with the light of day. Without the binary contrast of dark and light, without any possibility of foreground and background, they glide in secret or dance along the dazzling halls out of sight, above where the air shimmers like a sea. The noon setting of the first stanza suggests that the lights may be ubiquitous and yet still unknown. The final stanza of Merwin's four-stanza poem takes us into the darkness, where the lights are usually encountered. But the lights Merwin reflects on in the poem's coda are not those seen on Mitchell Flat on the way to Paisano Pass. The bright appearances are in the eye of the mind. Merwin is using the metaphorical trope of illumination as knowing, and he's meditating on the phenomenology of perception. To see and process ideas, we concede a vast realm of darkness, which we cannot know. We know from the beginning that darkness is beyond us, and there is no explaining the dark. This darkness is more than a blind spot. It is a vast emptiness upon which our existence and our small knowledge depend. The final stanza is preoccupied with the prevalence of the unknown. Merwin has striven to make darkness visible. The dark background is foregrounded. However, in the tone of a reproach, the poem concludes, it is only the light that we keep feeling a need to account for. As an account, what we know is only provisional. It is little more than ignis fatuus, fool's fire. Nevertheless, Merwin's coda on the Marfa Lights gives us a sense of the mutuality of the known and the unknown, and the depth and the value of the unknown. One more context for understanding the relationship between the lights and the darkness in Merwin's poem is Zen Buddhism, a significant influence in Merwin's worldview. The darkness, or the unknown, correlates to the idea of emptiness, sunya in Sanskrit, or Zen in Japanese. A concept, when associated with vastness, fits well in the West Texas landscape. In a Lannan Foundation interview with Naomi Shihab Nye, Merwin explains that in poetry and the arts, the imagination which goes beyond knowledge moves closer to the unknown and comes out of the unknown. An echo of this can be heard in Shunryu Suzuki's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. We say true existence comes from emptiness and goes back again into emptiness. What appears from emptiness is true true existence. We have to go through the gate of emptiness. Darkness is the source of creativity, but it's also the means by which phenomena are revealed and a path to insight. For Merwin, the vast emptiness where the lights appear are the source of awe and wonder, which fit the reflective purposes of poetry. In practicing Zen, one endeavors to cease clinging to habitual and easy explanations. Escaping illusions is the broad process of ending suffering described in the Four Noble Truths. Enrique Madrid, a Llano Apache living in the Big Bend, categorizes our responses to the Marfa lights culturally. The Mexicans call them Diablo, the Indians spirits, the white man UFOs. Each of these are merely labels and partial explanations that can block or obscure insight. Merwin explains problems with knowing. What you know is deceptive. What you know can hide what you don't know and make you think that it's the real thing, but it isn't. It's an aspect of the real thing. The real thing is always what you don't know. Merwin does not ascribe to the adage, write what you know. Enigmatically, you know what you don't know. The many diverse accounts of the lights make any one account less certain, but the very ineffability of the lights paradoxically makes them more meaningful. Both Thoreau and Merwin present the lights as phenomenologically overturning what we thought we knew. For Merwin, the obscurity of the lights makes them more present. Thoreau emphasizes his affinity to these other beings. They are fellow creatures. Merwin's the Marfa lights may also have this tonality. Discussing our relationship with nature, he explains everything is linked back to one-celled animals. There is no break. There is a continuum. If you have an awareness, you are a part of the world. Everything is alive. Everything there is. Everything that doesn't seem to be alive is alive. Again, paradoxically, it is the mysteriousness of the lights as beings that may bring them closer to us. This affirms a common feature of the lore of the Marfa lights, that they are protective spirits which have often saved cowboys who are lost or struggling in inclement weather. Okay, just one more minute. They have the alterity of the absolute other described by Emmanuel Levinas. The stranger, says Levinas, disturbs being at home with oneself, is the free one, over which I have no power, and is the ground of all our ethical relations with all particular others. In the sweat lodge ceremonies held at several protest encampments in the Big Bend, gratitude is always expressed at each stage of the sweat as a blessing to all my relations, which affirms our ties to the earth and all living things elliptically. Oh, I do use the word elliptically, because all living things have a spiritual identity. Linda Hogan writes in her memoir, Dwellings, there is a still place, a gap between worlds, spoken by the tribal knowings of thousands of years. At times when we are silent enough, still enough, we take a step into such a mystery, the place of spirit. And mystery, we must remember, by its very nature, does not wish to be known. I'm going to end there, and there's one slide here. I tried to write this poem about the main contents. Poetry comes from mystery. Mystery lights are living beings. Beings exist in relationships. Relationships make up a home, the spirits of a place.
We do have time for questions, and I just thought I'd put out this general announcement that we usually go over to the library, front of the library at this time for lunch for the presenters, but I know that several presenters won't be here, so anybody in the room who wants to come to lunch, please come. But let's have some Q&A here for Shelley and Theron, and if it gets heavy, you can go over there, eat tacos. Ask questions.
Do you want to stand up? Should we stand up over here? Or we could sit down today.
I have a question for Theron. clarification. Could you say the name of the Kurosawa film again?
Dreams.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thanks.
Maybe people have some answers.
Oh, it's always good. It's always good.
Hi, this question is for Shelley. First off, thank you for this book. It's phenomenal. It seems reading through it that you're very conscious of a sort of lineage of nature writers, particularly women nature writers, who are arguing, or not arguing, but discussing waste spaces. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about how do you position your work within this genealogy of nature writing and women writers?
Well, I think as my editor compared the book with Terry Tempest Williams, and I nearly had a heart attack. So I would not go that far, but you know, Refuge, her book, and there's a chapter in my book called Refuge, which is about the Antelope Creek people's places on these misses, which fascinated me because they were there for 300 years living almost, continuously, but also intermittently because they had camps out in front of Buffalo, and it was a very difficult life. So I don't know, I really hadn't thought about situating myself within women nature writers, except that I'm a great admirer of all of them, of course, and I have taught courses in environmental literature, and I probably couldn't help but be influenced by them. But I would very graciously love to be considered part of the of the group that we have, that we heard about so wonderfully yesterday with the books being dedicated to of nature writers. And I think particularly The Outermost House, that book, have you read that particular one? It's about Cape Cod, and he has, I can actually remember a left-handed side of the page and the bottom of the page where this particular quote is, but I can't give you the quote. which is really about a segueing from, and this is what I try so hard to do in my book, from kind of reportage or documentary or facts or observation to spiritual levels of things, or to a space for them, I should say. So I'm not answering your question, I'm sorry, but I would love for this book to find its place there, because I also think we don't have enough on the Llano. I don't know of many books at all that are like memoirs or things like that.
I'd like to thank Theron for writing about something that's specifically Texas, Marfa Lights.
Absolutely. That is such a
Getting that out into the world for people to know about that. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad that I got to present beside you and we saw the
Me
two
too.
ends of the Llano stuff.
Yeah, I hope we can talk some more, really. I think we can stay in touch.
I have another question for Theron. In which of Merlin's books does the Marfa Lights poem appear?
The pupil came out about 2002.
A question for Theron. You said at the beginning that this work was in part response to the Trans-Pecos pipeline protest, and that they asked you to write about the Marfa Lights, or to speak about the
They
Marfa
asked me to
Lights.
speak about the native stories about the Marfa Lights.
So that, just that is interesting to me. Was it part of the beginning of protest, kind of setting the
Yeah, there are a number of
context
speakers.
or the place?
Frankie Arona was one of the speakers, and Lori Glover, who's later in the video, and Frankie Arona, I think he's from San Antonio, I'm not sure, but he's associated with the American Indian movement in Texas. He spoke, and Juan Mancias was there, he's another leader in the American Indian movement. They've gone up and back to the DAPL side, and so it was important for us to, the struggle is to get national attention.
Did you?
Yeah, we did. We got, not enough to stop anything, because I guess it could go two ways. Obviously, we inspired the conservative forces to approve all of these pipelines. But we...
Are the same groups concerned about the border wall, the pending border wall? That's what I'm wondering.
Right, right. We are, and they may be involved, and the Native Americans are concerned about that as well. And they see, of course, it goes right along the river, and it's a cause of fragmentation.
Absolutely.
And then it's simply a message of hate. It doesn't really serve any practical function. Yeah, and this all began the protests all began in somebody's home who was the leader of the Sierra Club, and as a result, a number of different smaller organizations developed, and then Lori Glover saw that really the DAPL protest started. It seemed to us afterwards, and then we said, well, we can get national attention here if we connect the two. And Native Americans in Texas said, yes, we have to fight for this like they're fighting, fight against this like they're fighting against that up in the Dakotas.
This is Dr. Armitage. Thank you both for your presentations. Beautiful. A friend of mine actually worked with Dr. Bowles over in the wildlife ecology club. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And they're actually doing some work, specifically one of the theses that was presented this semester looks at the effects of wind turbines on the eagle habitats, the golden eagle specifically. And I didn't know if you were aware of any of the research, because you bring that up, and I think that probably
There's a strong environmental
Yeah.
message in this, which I try to control a little bit, but not really. I know of some research, I don't know if there's particularly, and I'm shocked at how many people don't know the effect on bats and raptors and swans. Plus there's, when the turbines